The morning Ryan walked into my apartment with that look on his face, the one that said he'd rehearsed his speech in the mirror, I was folding his lucky presentation tie. The navy one with tiny gold threads that caught the light just right. He'd worn it to every important meeting for 3 years, and I'd ironed it perfectly each time, making sure the creases were sharp enough to cut paper. That's what I did. I took care of the details nobody else noticed, the small things that made the difference between success and failure. I should have realized that in his eyes, I was just another small detail, easily replaced when something shinier came along. "We need to talk," he said, and my hands stilled on the silk fabric. Outside, the city was waking up. Car horns, distant sirens, the rumble of the subway beneath our building. Normal sounds for a Thursday morning, but something in his voice made everything feel off-kilter, like the world had tilted just slightly on its axis. I set down the tie carefully, smoothing it one last time. About what? He couldn't meet my eyes. Ryan Morrison, who could stare down hostile board members and negotiate million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, couldn't look at me. About us. About everything. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, filling the silence. I'd set it to brew his favorite dark roast, the expensive kind from that little shop in Brooklyn. 2 sugars, no cream. After 3 years together, I knew his morning routine better than my own. "Just say it," I whispered, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm seeing someone else." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I watched them drift, unable to grasp their meaning at first. We'd just been talking about vacation plans last week. He'd bookmarked flights to Santorini on his laptop, left the tab open where I could see it. A surprise, I'd thought. How stupid I'd been. Who? The question came out before I could stop it, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Victoria Chen. Of course, the boss's daughter, the one who joined the company 6 months ago with her Harvard MBA and her designer suits and her laugh that sounded like champagne bubbles. The one who'd never had to prove herself because her last name was engraved on the building. I'd seen the way she looked at Ryan during meetings, the way she'd find excuses to stop by his office. I'd told myself I was being paranoid. How long? Another question I didn't want answered. 2 months. 2 months, 8 weeks, 56 days of lies. I thought back to all those late nights at the office he'd claimed, all those weekend strategy sessions. My stomach turned. "Emma, you have to understand," he started, finally looking at me with those green eyes I'd fallen for in the break room 3 years ago. "This is about my future, my career. You're wonderful, you really are, but Victoria, she can open doors for me. Her father is Charles Chen, CEO of Chen Industries. I know who he is, Ryan. I worked there too, remember? Or did you forget about the invisible girl from accounting?" That's what I was. Invisible. The quiet one who processed invoices and balanced budgets while everyone else made the big decisions. The one who brought homemade cookies to office parties but never got invited to the important dinners. The girlfriend who ironed the tie but would never wear the ring. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible, like you're just a supporting character in someone else's success story, then keep listening. Because sometimes the universe has a way of rewriting the script when you least expect it. Sometimes the invisible ones have the most interesting secrets. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Ryan had the decency to look ashamed for about 3 seconds. Then his expression hardened into something I'd seen him use on difficult clients. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'll have my things moved out by the weekend. You can keep the apartment. The lease is in your name anyway." How generous. I'd been the one with steady credit when we'd moved in together. Another invisible contribution to our life that he'd benefited from. "Is that all?" I asked, still holding myself perfectly still, afraid that if I moved, I'd shatter into 1,000 pieces. "Emma?" He reached for me, then thought better of it. "We can still be professional at work. This doesn't have to affect—" "Get out." He left with just his briefcase and gym bag, abandoning 3 years of accumulated life like it meant nothing. The tie still lay on the couch, perfectly pressed, waiting for a presentation that would never come. I didn't cry. Not then. I sat in the sudden silence of what used to be our apartment and stared at that stupid tie until the coffee maker beeped, reminding me that his dark roast was ready. 2 sugars, no cream. I walked to the kitchen, picked up the full pot, and poured it down the sink. The smell filled the apartment, rich, bitter, wrong. That's when my phone rang. Unknown number, but local area code. Miss Emma Hartley? The voice was professional, crisp, the kind that usually meant bad news or sales calls. Yes? My name is Jonathan Westbrook from Westbrook and Associates. I'm calling regarding your grandmother, Margaret Sinclair. My grandmother. I'd never known her name was Margaret Sinclair. To me, she'd always been Grandma Maggie, the woman who died when I was 7, leaving behind nothing but fuzzy memories of lavender perfume and stories about princes and princesses. My mother never talked about her, changing the subject whenever I asked why we had no photos, no heirlooms, no connection to that side of the family. I think you have the wrong person, I said. My grandmother passed away 20 years ago. Yes, I'm aware. However, there's been a development regarding her estate. Would it be possible for you to come to my office today? I understand this is short notice, but it's quite urgent. I almost laughed. What could possibly be urgent about a woman who'd been dead for 2 decades? But something in his tone made me pause. Besides, what else was I going to do? Sit in my empty apartment and stare at the indent in the couch where Ryan used to sit. What's this about? I asked. I'd prefer to discuss it in person, Miss Hartley. Are you free this afternoon? I thought about my day ahead, processing purchase orders, entering data, watching Ryan and Victoria pretend they were just colleagues while everyone whispered behind their backs because office secrets never stay secret. Invisible work in a place where I'd just become even more invisible, the pathetic ex-girlfriend who'd been traded up for the boss's daughter. I'll be there in an hour, I said. The law office was in one of those old buildings downtown that still had brass fixtures and marble floors, the kind that whispered of old money and older secrets. Jonathan Westbrook looked exactly like I'd pictured. Silver-haired, immaculate suit, the kind of presence that commanded respect without trying. His office smelled of leather and legal books, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. "Thank you for coming, Miss Hartley," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his massive oak desk. "I apologize for the mysterious nature of my call, but this situation is unusual." "You said this was about my grandmother?" "Indeed." He pulled out a thick folder, its edges yellowed with age. "Margaret Sinclair was quite an extraordinary woman. Are you aware of her background?" "She died when I was 7, I said. "My mother doesn't talk about her." "No, I imagine she wouldn't." Something flickered across his expression. Sympathy, maybe, or understanding. "Your grandmother was born Margaret Chen." The name hit me like cold water. "Chen? As in Chen Industries, yes. She was Charles Chen's sister." The room spun slightly. Charles Chen, the man whose daughter had just stolen my boyfriend. Charles Chen, my boss, the man who ruled the company like a medieval king. He was my great-uncle? "That's impossible," I said. "My mother's maiden name was Sinclair. We have no connection to the Chens." Mr. Westbrook pulled out a photograph, black and white, edges worn from handling. A young woman smiled at the camera, her face unmistakably similar to mine. The same sharp cheekbones, the same stubborn chin. Standing next to her was a young man who could only be Charles Chen, decades younger, but with the same imperious expression I knew from company portraits. Margaret Chen married Robert Sinclair against her family's wishes in 1975, Mr. Westbrook explained. Robert was considered unsuitable. He was a teacher, you see. No money, no connections, just a good heart and a love for literature. The Chen family disowned her completely, cut her off from the family fortune, the business, everything. She chose love over money, and they never forgave her for it. I stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this story with the grandmother I barely remembered. But why are you telling me this now? Because of this. He pulled out another document, this one crisp and new. 6 months ago, I received instructions from a Swiss bank. Your grandmother, it seems, wasn't as penniless as her family believed. She'd inherited shares in Chen Industries from her grandfather, shares that her father couldn't take away, though he tried. She held on to them quietly, never selling, never revealing she had them. They've been sitting in a trust for 20 years, waiting. Waiting for what? For the conditions of her will to be met. She specified that the shares should pass to her descendant only when Charles Chen's heir apparent, his child, entered the company formally. She wanted to ensure that her legacy would return to Chen Industries at exactly the right moment to make an impact. Victoria, I breathed. Victoria joined the company 6 months ago. Precisely, which triggered the release of your inheritance. He pushed a document across the desk. Miss Hartley, you now own 38% of Chen Industries. The number didn't make sense. I stared at it, waiting for him to correct himself, to say he meant 3.8% or something reasonable. That would make me the largest individual shareholder, yes. Charles Chen owns 35%. The board and various investors hold the rest. Your grandmother was very clever with her investments, you see. Those shares she inherited, they were worth almost nothing in 1975. But she held them, and they split, and they grew, and she quietly acquired more through shell companies whenever she could. She played a very long game, Miss Hartley, and now you're the winner. I couldn't breathe. This morning I'd been nobody, the invisible girl from accounting whose boyfriend had just left her for someone more important. Now I owned more of the company than the CEO himself. There's more, Mr. Westbrook said, and I wondered how there could possibly be more. Your grandmother left detailed journals. She documented everything, every slight from her family, every attempt they made to force her to sell her shares, every move Charles made to consolidate power. She also left instructions. He handed me a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with elegant handwriting. She wanted you to know the truth about the Chen family, about what they did to her, and about what she wanted you to do with her legacy. I opened the journal to a random page, and my grandmother's words leaped out at me. Charles always believed that power was about being seen, being feared. He never understood that real power comes from being underestimated. Let them think. You're weak. Let them dismiss you. And then, when they least expect it, show them what the invisible ones can do. Does Charles know? I asked. About the shares? He will be informed at Monday's board meeting, per your grandmother's instructions. She wanted it to be public. Monday. 4 days away. 4 days of knowing something that would change everything, while everyone around me continued to treat me like I was nobody. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Mr. Westbrook smiled for the first time. Whatever you want, Miss Hartley. That's the beauty of power. It gives you choices. Your grandmother waited 20 years for this moment. The question is, what have you been waiting for? I left his office with a briefcase full of documents and a head full of possibilities. The city looked different somehow, sharper, more vivid. Every building seemed to hold secrets, every face in the crowd a potential ally or enemy. I walked for hours, trying to process what had just happened. Ryan had left me because I wasn't enough. I was just Emma from accounting, the girl who brought homemade cookies and remembered everyone's birthdays, but would never be invited to the important meetings. Victoria had everything: the name, the connections, the power to advance his career. Next to her, I was invisible. But maybe being invisible had its advantages. I thought about my grandmother, choosing love over money, walking away from everything she'd known. But she hadn't really walked away, had she? She'd been playing a longer game, one that spanned generations. She'd been invisible too, dismissed and forgotten, while quietly building something that would outlast them all. That night, I sat in my empty apartment and read her journals cover to cover. Page after page of careful observations, strategic planning, and occasionally raw pain. She wrote about her brother Charles, how he'd stood by while their father threw her out, how he'd promised to help her but never did, how he'd built his empire on the foundation their grandfather had left while pretending she'd never existed. "He thinks power is about taking," she wrote in one entry, "but real power is about patience. It's about knowing when to strike and having the courage to wait for that moment. Emma, my dear one, if you're reading this, know that I've given you the weapon. How you use it is up to you." She'd known my name. Somehow, she'd known about me, even though she'd died when I was so young. Had she been watching from afar? Had she kept track of us even as we'd been kept from her? The weekend passed in a blur. Ryan came for his things while I was out. I'd made sure to be gone, unable to face him yet. He left his key on the counter with a note that said simply, "I'm sorry." I threw the note away but kept the key. You never know when you might need to lock someone out. Sunday evening, I stood in front of my closet, staring at my wardrobe. Sensible skirts, modest blouses, the uniform of someone trying not to be noticed. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, Charles Chen would learn that his invisible employee was actually his largest shareholder, that his sister's daughter, the one he'd pretended didn't exist, owned more of his company than he did. But first, I had to get through one more day of being nobody. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made the city feel smaller, more oppressive. I arrived at the Chen Industries building at my usual time, swiped my badge at the employee entrance, and took the service elevator to the accounting floor. Everything looked exactly the same, the fluorescent lights humming their familiar tune, the smell of burnt coffee from the break room, the quiet chatter of early arrivals. "Emma," my colleague Sarah waved from her cubicle. "Did you hear? There's some kind of emergency board meeting this afternoon. Charles Chen called it himself. The executives are all freaking out." "Really?" I kept my voice neutral, focusing on unpacking my bag. "Any idea what it's about?" "Nobody knows, but Victoria's been in his office all morning. She looked upset when she came out for coffee." Victoria, my replacement, the woman who had everything I didn't. I wondered if she knew what was coming, if Charles had given her any warning about the storm that was about to hit. The morning crawled by. I processed invoices, answered emails, attended a mind-numbing meeting about new expense report procedures. All the while, the knowledge of what was coming sat like a stone in my stomach. At lunch, I saw Ryan in the cafeteria, sitting with Victoria at the executive table. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting possessively on his arm. He looked happy. They both did. For a moment, doubt crept in. What was I doing? These people had their whole lives planned out. Ryan would marry Victoria, take over some division of the company, and live happily ever after in their world of privilege and power. Who was I to disrupt that? Then I remembered my grandmother's words. They will make you doubt yourself. They will make you feel small, unworthy, out of place. That's how they maintain their power, by convincing others they don't deserve any. Don't let them. At 2:30, my phone buzzed, a text from Mr. Westbrook. "The board has been informed. The meeting starts in 30 minutes. You should be there." My hands shook as I saved my work and closed my computer. This was it. The moment everything changed. I stood, smoothed my sensible skirt, and headed for the elevator. But instead of pressing the button for the boardroom floor, I found myself pressing the button for the executive level. I needed to see something first. The executive floor was all glass and chrome, a world away from the cubicle farm where I worked. Original art hung on the walls, and the carpet was so thick it absorbed every sound. I'd only been up here once before, delivering urgent documents that couldn't wait for inter-office mail. Charles Chen's office occupied the corner, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The door was open, and I could hear voices inside. Charles's commanding baritone and Victoria's higher, more agitated tone. "What do you mean someone else owns more shares?" Victoria was saying. "That's impossible. You've always been the majority shareholder." "Not the majority," Charles corrected, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The largest individual shareholder. There's a difference. And apparently, that distinction no longer belongs to me. But who? Who could possibly? I don't know yet. The lawyers are being coy, saying the new shareholder will be at the meeting. Some kind of trust that's just matured. I've had people looking into it all morning, but whoever set this up was careful. Very careful." "This is a disaster," Victoria said. "If we don't have control, we'll handle it," Charles interrupted. "We always do. Whoever this is, they can be bought or intimidated. Everyone has a price or a pressure point." I stepped back from the door, my heart racing. They had no idea it was me, no idea that the invisible girl from accounting was about to flip their world upside down. The thought should have been satisfying, but instead, I felt oddly calm. This wasn't about revenge, I realized. It was about justice, about balancing scales that had been tipped for too long. The boardroom was on the top floor, a glass-walled space that seemed to float above the city. I'd never been inside, only walked past it on my way to deliver reports. Now, I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The room was already half full. Board members in expensive suits clustered in small groups, whispering urgently. They all looked up when I entered, and I saw the confusion in their eyes. What was someone like me doing here? "Excuse me," one of them said, Richard Blackwood, according to his nameplate, a silver-haired man who looked like he'd been born in a boardroom. "This is a closed meeting. Employees aren't—" "I'm not here as an employee," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm here as a shareholder." The whispers stopped. Everyone stared. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" another board member asked. Before I could answer, the door opened again. Charles Chen strode in, followed by Victoria, and to my surprise, Ryan. Of course he'd be here. Victoria's new boyfriend, being groomed for management, invited to watch the proceedings. His eyes widened when he saw me, and I saw him mouth "Emma" to Victoria. "What is she doing here?" Victoria demanded, not bothering to lower her voice. "Security should—" "Miss Hartley is here at my invitation," Mr. Westbrook said, entering behind them with his briefcase. As the representative of the Margaret Sinclair Trust, Charles Chen went very still. The color drained from his face as he stared at me, and I saw the exact moment he understood. "Margaret," he whispered, "you're Margaret's granddaughter." "Hello, Uncle Charles," I said, and the room erupted. It took 20 minutes to restore order. Board members demanded explanations, papers were produced and verified, and through it all, Charles Chen said nothing. He sat at the head of the table, staring at me like I was a ghost, which, in a way, I suppose I was, the ghost of his discarded sister, come back to haunt him. Finally, when the legal verification was complete and everyone understood that I was indeed the new largest shareholder of Chen Industries, Charles spoke. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. "You're a junior accountant. You know nothing about running a company. You can't seriously expect—" "I expect," I interrupted, standing to address the room, "to be treated with the same respect you'd show any other major shareholder. I expect my voice to be heard in decisions affecting this company. And I expect the Chen family to finally acknowledge what they did to my grandmother." "What we did?" Charles's face flushed. "She chose to leave. She chose that nobody teacher over her family, over her responsibilities. She chose love," I said, "and you chose to punish her for it. You stood by while your father threw her out. You let her struggle, let her daughter, my mother, grow up in poverty while you built your empire on the foundation your grandfather left to both of you." "That's ancient history," Victoria interjected. "It has nothing to do with—" It has everything to do with this, I said, turning to face her. You've had every advantage, every opportunity, because of who your father is. You've never had to prove yourself, never had to earn your place. You walked into this company 6 months ago and were immediately fast-tracked for leadership. Not because of your abilities, though I'm sure you're very capable, but because of your name. Victoria's face reddened. How dare you? I dare, I said, because I've watched it happen. I've been here for 3 years, working 60-hour weeks, saving this company money, finding discrepancies that no one else bothered to look for. But I was invisible because I was nobody. Just Emma from accounting. Not worth noticing, certainly not worth promoting, not worth keeping. I looked at Ryan then, really looked at him for the first time since he'd walked into the boardroom. He had the grace to look ashamed. But being invisible has its advantages, I continued, pulling out a folder I'd prepared over the weekend. You see things, you hear things, you learn things. Like how certain executives have been using company funds for personal expenses. I slid a report across the table. Or how certain contracts were awarded based on personal relationships rather than merit. Another report. Or how certain people have been promoted despite documented performance issues simply because of who they're related to or sleeping with. The room was dead silent. Charles Chen's hands were clenched on the table, his knuckles white. What do you want? He asked finally. Change, I said simply. This company has been run like a medieval fiefdom for too long. Nepotism, favoritism, the old boys club deciding everything behind closed doors. It ends now. You can't, Charles started. I can, I said. I own 38% of this company. You own 35%. The board owns the rest. Every major decision requires shareholder approval, which means, Uncle Charles, you need me more than I need you. Richard Blackwood cleared his throat. Miss Hartley, while your concerns are interesting, surely we can discuss this in a more private setting. There's no need for theatrics. Isn't there? I asked. My grandmother tried the private approach. She wrote letters, made phone calls, tried to reconcile with her family for years. She was ignored, dismissed, forgotten. So no, Mr. Blackwood, I don't think private discussions are the answer. I think transparency is. I pulled out my laptop and connected it to the boardroom's projection system. I've prepared a presentation on some suggested changes to company structure and policy. I think you'll find them illuminating. For the next hour, I laid out everything I'd discovered in my 3 years of being invisible. The waste, the corruption, the toxic culture that started at the top and trickled down. I showed them how much money the company was losing to nepotism and cronyism. I presented solutions, clear promotion criteria, transparent financial reporting, accountability measures. Through it all, Charles Chen's face grew darker, Victoria's grew paler, and Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Richard Blackwood spoke up. This is comprehensive. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this. 3 years of thought, I agreed. 3 years of watching and learning and waiting for someone in power to care. No one did. So now I'm the one with power, and I care very much. This is insane, Victoria burst out. You can't just walk in here and... I can, I said calmly, and I am, starting with some immediate changes. First, all executive positions will be subject to performance review, no exceptions for family members. Second, there will be a full audit of company finances going back 5 years. Third, we're implementing a blind promotion system. Candidates will be evaluated based on their work, not their connections. And if we refuse? Charles asked, his voice dangerous. Then I call for a vote of no confidence in your leadership, I said. I have 38%. I've already spoken with several board members who are concerned about recent financial irregularities. I think you'll find that your 35% isn't quite the shield you think it is. The threat hung in the air. Charles Chen, who'd ruled this company for 30 years, was being challenged by his invisible niece. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. You're just bitter, Victoria said suddenly. This is about Ryan, isn't it? You're trying to punish us because he left me for you?" I finished. "No, Victoria, this isn't about Ryan, though I do find it interesting that he's here, in a meeting he has no business attending, simply because he's dating the boss's daughter. That's exactly the kind of favoritism I'm talking about." Ryan finally spoke up. "Emma, please, can we talk about this?" "We're talking now," I said, "in front of everyone. No more backroom deals, no more private arrangements, everything in the open." "This is ridiculous." Charles stood abruptly. "I won't stand for this." "Then sit," I suggested, "because I'm not finished." He stared at me, and for a moment, I saw my grandmother in his eyes, the same stubborn set to his jaw, the same proud tilt to his chin. We were family, whether he liked it or not. "Your sister," I said quietly, "died believing you hated her. She died thinking she wasn't good enough for the Chen family, but she never stopped loving you. She kept your picture, you know, that photo of you both as children. It was the only thing from her old life she couldn't let go of." Something shifted in Charles's expression. "Margaret's dead?" 20 years ago, cancer. She didn't have insurance for the good treatments, too proud to ask for help from the family that discarded her, too poor to afford what might have saved her." The words hit him like physical blows. He sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "But she won in the end," I continued. "She held on to those shares, grew them, nurtured them like a garden, not for revenge, but for justice, for a chance to make things right. That's what I'm offering now, a chance to make things right." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Richard Blackwood cleared his throat. "I move to implement Miss Hartley's proposed changes, subject to legal review and board approval." "Seconded," said another board member quickly. "All in favor?" Richard asked. One by one, hands rose around the table. Even some of Charles's longtime allies voted yes. They could see which way the wind was blowing. In the end, only Charles and Victoria voted against. "Motion carried," Richard announced. "Miss Hartley, we look forward to working with you on these implementations." The meeting adjourned in chaos. Board members surrounded me with questions and congratulations. Charles left without a word, Victoria trailing behind him. Ryan lingered, trying to catch my eye, but I ignored him. I had more important things to deal with. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The audit revealed what I'd suspected. Millions in misappropriated funds, contracts awarded to friends, and family members at inflated prices, executives drawing salaries for no-show positions. The cleanup was brutal, but necessary. Charles fought me at every turn, but the board was on my side now. They'd seen the numbers, understood the liability the company faced if these practices continued. One by one, his allies abandoned him. Victoria's position became untenable. Without her father's protection, her lack of experience became glaringly obvious. She'd been given responsibilities far beyond her capabilities, and without a safety net, she floundered. The blind performance review system I'd implemented was particularly damning. When stripped of her name and connections, her work was mediocre at best. Ryan tried to distance himself from the chaos, but it was too late. His association with Victoria had marked him as part of the old guard. His performance reviews, while better than Victoria's, weren't stellar enough to justify his rapid promotion track. He was reassigned to a position more suited to his actual experience level, a lateral move that was effectively a demotion. He came to my office one evening, 3 weeks after the board meeting. I'd moved to a proper office by then, though nothing ostentatious. I didn't need the corner suite to know I had power. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "About what?" I didn't look up from the report I was reading. "About us, about everything. Emma, I made a mistake." "Yes, you did." I set down the report and looked at him. Really looked at him. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished, or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. "You chose advancement over loyalty. You chose the easy path over the right one. That's your pattern, Ryan. You always take the shortcut." "I loved you," he said quietly. No, I replied. You loved what I did for you. The support, the stability, the way I made your life easier. But you never loved me, Emma, the person. If you had, you wouldn't have traded me for a promotion. Victoria and I are over, he said, as if that mattered. I know. She ended it when you couldn't help her anymore. That's what happens when relationships are built on transactions instead of genuine connection. He left without another word. I heard later that he'd transferred to the Chicago office, a fresh start or an escape. I wasn't sure which. The real confrontation with Charles came a month later. He called me to his office, the same one where I'd overheard him plotting to handle the new shareholder. He looked older, grayer, diminished by the changes I'd forced on his empire. You've made your point, he said without preamble. You've destroyed everything I built. I've saved everything you built, I corrected. The company was rotting from the inside. Another few years of your management, and there wouldn't have been anything left to fight over. You sound like her, he said suddenly. Like Margaret. Same self-righteous tone. Same stubborn conviction that you're right and everyone else is wrong. She was right, though, wasn't she? She said the family's obsession with money and power would destroy it. And look where we are. He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the city below. I was young when she left. 25, hungry for my father's approval. He said she was betraying the family, choosing an outsider over us. I believed him. And later, when you had your own family, your own perspective? By then, it was too late. The story was set. Margaret was the traitor who'd abandoned us for love. To reach out to her would have been to admit we were wrong. The Chen family doesn't admit mistakes. No, I agreed. It doesn't, which is why it's been making the same ones for 50 years. He turned to face me. What do you want from me? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry we cut Margaret off. I'm sorry she died alone. I'm sorry for all of it. Does that change anything? It might, I said, pulling out a document. This is a proposal for the Chen Foundation, a charitable organization funded by company profits, focused on providing education and healthcare to underprivileged families. It will be named after Margaret Sinclair. He read through it slowly. This would cost millions. Millions that would have gone to executive bonuses and shareholder dividends. Millions that can actually make a difference. The board has already given preliminary approval. They like the tax benefits and the positive publicity. They also like that it shows the company is moving in a new direction. He set down the proposal. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I had 3 years to plan, I reminded him. 3 years of being invisible in your company, watching, learning, preparing. My grandmother had 20 years. Between us, we've had plenty of time to think of everything. And Victoria? What happens to her? That's up to her. She can stay and earn her position like everyone else, or she can leave and find her own path. But her days of coasting on your name are over. He nodded slowly. You're going to fire me, aren't you? Push me out of my own company. No, I said, surprising him. You built this company. Despite your flaws, you have valuable experience and connections. But your role needs to change. I'm proposing you move to Chairman Emeritus, an advisory position. You'll have influence, but not control. And who would be CEO? Someone we choose together. Someone who represents both the company's history and its future. Someone who isn't a Chen. It took him a moment to understand what I was offering. A graceful exit, a way to save face while still implementing necessary changes. It was more than he'd given my grandmother, more than he deserved, but I wasn't doing it for him. Why? He asked. Why not destroy me completely? You have the power. Because, I said, my grandmother didn't hold onto those shares for revenge. She held onto them for redemption, for a chance to heal what was broken. Destroying you wouldn't honor her memory. Rebuilding what you broke might. He looked at me for a long time, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not quite respect, but recognition. An acknowledgement that I wasn't the invisible girl from accounting anymore. The board meeting is next week, I said, standing to leave. Think about my proposal. And Charles? Think about what Margaret would have wanted. Not the Margaret you remember, the angry young woman who defied your father, but the Margaret she became, the woman who chose love over money and never regretted it, even when love wasn't enough to save her. The next week, Charles Chen announced his transition to chairman emeritus. The news sent shockwaves through the business world. The king was stepping down, not in disgrace, but in what the press releases called a planned transition to ensure the company's continued growth and modernization. Victoria left the company entirely. I heard she went back to school, this time to earn her achievements instead of having them handed to her. Maybe she'd learned something from all of this. Maybe not. It wasn't my concern anymore. The new CEO we hired, a brilliant woman from outside the Chen family orbit, transformed the company within a year. Profits soared, employee satisfaction improved, and Chen Industries became known as a model for corporate reform. The Margaret Sinclair Foundation funded scholarships for first-generation college students and provided healthcare grants to families in need. I kept my office in the building, though my role evolved from invisible accountant to very visible major shareholder. I attended every board meeting, reviewed every major decision, and ensured that the company never forgot the lessons we'd learned. One day, about a year after everything changed, I was cleaning out my apartment and found Ryan's lucky tie, the one I'd been ironing when he told me about Victoria. I held it up to the light, remembering how important it had seemed, how carefully I'd pressed it, how much I'd wanted to be the perfect supportive girlfriend. I threw it in the donation bin without a second thought. That evening, I attended a foundation gala, the kind of event I'd never have been invited to in my invisible days. I wore a dress that cost more than I used to make in a month, and I didn't feel guilty about it. I'd earned it. Charles was there, looking older, but somehow more at peace. He approached me during the cocktail hour, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "Emma," he said, offering me a glass, "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For saving me from myself, for showing me what I'd become, for giving me a chance to make amends, even if it's too late for the person who most deserved them." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Do you think she would have forgiven me?" he asked quietly. "Margaret." I thought about my grandmother's journals, her pain and anger, but also her enduring love for the brother who'd betrayed her. "I think she forgave you a long time ago," I said. "She just wanted you to earn it." He nodded, blinking rapidly. "I'm trying." I know. The gala was a success. We raised millions for the foundation, money that would go to families like the one my grandmother had raised, families rich in love but struggling with everything else. During my speech, I talked about the invisible people, the ones who keep the world running while others take credit. I talked about my grandmother, who'd been erased from her family's history, but who'd never stopped believing in justice. I talked about transformation, redemption, and the power of patience. Sometimes, I concluded, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's success. It's taking the thing that was meant to destroy you and turning it into your greatest strength. It's becoming visible, not through force, but through undeniable competence. It's proving that love and money don't have to be mutually exclusive, that you can have both if you're willing to fight for them. The applause was thunderous, but the moment that mattered most came later, when a young woman approached me. She was maybe 22, working as a server at the event, and she waited until her shift was over to talk to me. "Miss Hartley," she said nervously, "I just wanted to say, I heard your speech about being invisible, about people not seeing your worth. That's me. I'm in night school, working 3 jobs, and everyone treats me like I'm nobody. But hearing your story, it gives me hope." I looked at her, really looked at her, saw the exhaustion beneath her careful makeup, the determination in her eyes, the same hunger I'd once felt to be more than what the world told me I could be. "What's your name?" I asked. Maria Santos." "Maria, Do you know about the Margaret Sinclair Foundation's scholarship program? I've heard of it, but apply, I said firmly. And when you do, mention this conversation. I'll make sure your application gets proper consideration. Her eyes filled with tears. Thank you so much. Don't thank me, I said. Thank my grandmother. She's the one who made all of this possible. As Maria walked away, clutching my business card like a lifeline, I thought about cycles, about how my grandmother's exile had led to my rise, about how my rise had led to opportunities for people like Maria, about how Maria might one day change someone else's life. Ryan reached out once more, about 2 years after everything happened. An email, carefully worded, asking if we could have coffee. I want to apologize properly, he wrote, and I want to understand what I missed when I was too blind to see who you really were. I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to let him live with his regrets, the way I'd lived with my invisibility. But that wasn't who I wanted to be. We met at a small cafe, nothing fancy. He looked good, successful in a middle management kind of way. The kind of success he'd earned rather than been handed. You look well, he said, stating the obvious. I was wearing designer clothes, carrying a bag that cost more than his monthly rent. But more than that, I carried myself differently. I took up space now, unapologetically. I am well, I agreed. I heard about everything you've done with the company. The reforms, the foundation, it's impressive. It's necessary. He played with his coffee cup, searching for words. I was an idiot. Yes. I threw away something real for something that was just smoke and mirrors. Yes. I'm sorry. I know. He looked up at me then, and I saw genuine regret in his eyes. Do you ever think about what might have been if I hadn't... No, I interrupted, because if you hadn't left me for Victoria, I might never have discovered who I really am. I might have spent my whole life being invisible, supporting your dreams while ignoring my own. Your betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was true. The pain of that morning when he'd walked out had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Without it, I might never have answered Mr. Westbrook's call, never claimed my inheritance, never found my voice. I loved you, he said quietly. I know you don't believe that, but I did. I just loved myself more. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me, I replied. We parted cordially, two people who'd once shared a life now living in completely different worlds. I didn't hate him anymore. I nothinged him, which was somehow worse for him than hatred would have been. The company continued to thrive under new leadership. The blind performance review system I'd implemented became an industry standard, copied by corporations worldwide. The Margaret Sinclair Foundation expanded internationally, providing opportunities to invisible people everywhere. Charles and I developed an unexpected relationship, not quite family, but something close to it. He'd tell me stories about my grandmother as a child, filling in the gaps my mother couldn't or wouldn't discuss. In return, I'd share her journals with him, letting him see the sister he'd lost through her own words. She was brilliant, he said once, reading an entry about her investment strategies. If she'd stayed with the family, she could have built an empire. She did build an empire, I reminded him, just not the kind you expected. Victoria eventually returned to the city, humbled and changed. She'd earned an MBA on her own merits and started her own company, a small consulting firm that helped businesses implement ethical practices. She reached out to me once, a carefully worded email asking if I'd consider being an advisor. I declined, but I wished her well. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt, but that didn't mean I wished her ill. She'd been as trapped by the system as I had, just in a different way. 5 years after that first board meeting, I stood in the same boardroom, looking out at the city below. So much had changed. The company was unrecognizable from the nepotistic empire it had once been. The foundation had helped thousands of families, and I was no longer invisible. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. My assistant entered with a package. "This just arrived for you," she said. No return address, but it was marked urgent. I opened it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, worn with age, and inside that box was a necklace, a simple gold chain with a jade pendant. I recognized it immediately from my grandmother's photos. It was the one piece of jewelry she'd kept from her old life, the one thing she'd never sold even when times were hardest. There was a note. Found this in Mother's things. She always said it belonged to Aunt Margaret. Thought you should have it. Charles. I held the necklace up to the light, watching the jade catch the afternoon sun. My grandmother had worn this when she chose love over money, when she walked away from everything she'd known for a chance at happiness. She'd worn it through poverty and struggle, through illness and loss. And somehow, it had found its way back to the family, to me. I clasped it around my neck, feeling the weight of it against my chest. It was heavier than it looked, substantial in a way that modern jewelry rarely was. Like the legacy my grandmother had left me, heavier than it appeared, but solid, real, undeniable. My phone buzzed with a reminder. Another board meeting in 10 minutes. Another room full of powerful people who would have to listen to me, respect me, see me. I gathered my files, straightened my shoulders, and headed for the door. As I walked through the executive floor, employees nodded respectfully. Some even smiled genuinely. I'd fought for better conditions for them too, after all. I wasn't just the largest shareholder. I was the one who'd made their work lives bearable. The boardroom was filling up when I arrived. Charles was already there, in his advisory capacity. He nodded when he saw the necklace, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. The new CEO, Patricia Williams, was reviewing quarterly reports with the CFO. Various board members chatted over coffee. "Before we begin," I said, taking my seat, "I want to announce a new initiative for the Margaret Sinclair Foundation. We're launching an entrepreneurship program for women who've been overlooked by traditional funding sources. Women who have brilliant ideas, but no connections, no family money, no way to break into the old boys club." "The invisible women," Patricia said, understanding immediately. "Exactly. We're going to make them visible." The meeting proceeded with its usual efficiency. Decisions were made, strategies discussed, futures planned. But I found my mind wandering to my grandmother, to the young woman who'd chosen love over all of this. I wondered what she'd think if she could see me now, sitting in the boardroom she'd been banished from, wearing the necklace she'd treasured, wielding the power she'd secretly accumulated. I thought she'd be proud, not of the money or the influence, but of what I'd done with it, of how I'd turned her patience into purpose, her invisibility into insight, her legacy into something that lifted others up instead of keeping them down. After the meeting, I walked back to my office. Not the corner suite, which I'd left vacant as a reminder that power didn't need to be ostentatious. My space was comfortable but functional, with one wall dedicated to photos. My grandmother and grandfather on their wedding day. My mother as a child. The employees whose lives had been changed by the foundation. And yes, even a photo of Charles and Margaret as children before Pride and Prejudice tore them apart. My assistant knocked. "Ms. Hartley, there's someone here to see you. Says she's a recent foundation scholarship recipient. Send her in." It was Maria Santos, the young woman from the gala years ago. But she looked different now, confident, polished, radiating success. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said. "I graduated last month, top of my class. I've been offered a position at a major firm, but I wanted to ask, is Chen Industries hiring? I'd rather work for a company that values people like us." People like us, the invisible ones who'd become undeniable. "As a matter of fact," I said, "we are. Patricia's been looking for a new analyst, someone hungry, brilliant, and determined, someone who knows what it's like to fight for every opportunity." Maria's face lit up. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't." After she left, I stood at my window, looking out at the city. Somewhere out there were thousands of invisible people, working thankless jobs, supporting others' dreams, believing they weren't worthy of more. But change was coming, slowly, systematically, one scholarship, one opportunity, one reformed company at a time. My phone rang. It was my mother, calling for our weekly check-in. "Hi, Mom." "Emma, darling, how are you?" "Good. Busy, but good." "I saw the news about the Foundation's new program. Your grandmother would have loved it." "I know." There was a pause. My mother had struggled with the revelation about her mother's hidden wealth, the shares that could have made their lives so much easier if they'd only known. But she'd also understood why Margaret had waited, why she'd wanted the timing to be perfect. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, "for not letting the power change you, for remembering where you came from." "How could I forget?" I asked. "It's what makes me who I am." After we hung up, I returned to my desk. There was work to do, always more work. But I didn't mind. Every spreadsheet I reviewed, every decision I influenced, every change I implemented was a small victory for the invisible people everywhere. The sun was setting by the time I finished, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The city lights were beginning to twinkle on, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility. I gathered my things, preparing to head home to my new apartment. A penthouse, yes, but one I'd earned through my own efforts, not through connections or compromises. As I waited for the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman looking back at me was unrecognizable from the girl who'd folded Ryan's tie that morning 3 years ago. That girl had been invisible, uncertain, defined by her relationship to others. This woman was visible, confident, defined by her own achievements. The elevator arrived and I stepped inside. As the doors closed, I touched the jade pendant at my throat, feeling its cool smoothness against my fingers. My grandmother had worn it as a reminder of what she'd lost. I wore it as a reminder of what she'd found, the courage to choose her own path, the strength to play the long game, the wisdom to know that true power comes not from being seen, but from seeing everything. The elevator descended, carrying me from the heights of corporate power back to the street level where the real world waited, where invisible people hurried home from thankless jobs, where young women like Maria Santos were just beginning to dream of more, where the next Emma Hartley was probably folding someone else's tie, not knowing that her life was about to change. I walked through the lobby, my heels clicking on the marble floor. The security guard nodded respectfully. He knew who I was now. Everyone did. But I remembered when I'd been nobody, and I made sure to smile, to ask about his family, to see him the way I'd once wanted to be seen. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy. Taxis honked, people rushed past, the world spun on. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing in the exhaust and ambition, the dreams and disappointments that made up this place. My phone buzzed with a text from Charles. "Board dinner next week. You'll be there?" "Yes," I typed back. "I'll be there." I always would be. Watching, influencing, ensuring that the company never forgot its new values. Ensuring that my grandmother's legacy lived on not just in shares and dividends, but in real change, real opportunities, real lives transformed. A taxi pulled up and I climbed in, giving the driver my address. As we pulled away from the Chen Industries building, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew it would be there tomorrow, and I knew I'd be back, ready to fight another day for the invisible people, the overlooked ones, the ones who deserved so much more than they'd been given. "Rough day?" the driver asked, glancing in the rear-view mirror. "No," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "Actually, it was a pretty good day." He nodded, turning his attention back to the road. Just another fare, another invisible person doing invisible work. But I saw him. I saw them all now, and slowly but surely I was making sure the world saw them too. As we drove through the city, I thought about Ryan one last time. Not with anger or regret, but with something almost like gratitude. He'd left me for the boss's daughter, thinking he was trading up, thinking power was about who you knew rather than who you were. He'd been wrong, but his wrongness had set me free. I'd inherited more than a company. I'd inherited a purpose, a mission, a chance to rewrite the rules, and I'd fired them both, not just from their positions, but from the hold they'd had on my life, from the power they'd wielded over my self-worth. The taxi pulled up to my building, and I paid the driver, tipping generously. As I walked through my lobby, the doorman greeted me by name. "Evening, Ms. Hartley." "Evening, James." In my apartment, I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of wine. The good stuff now, not the cheap bottles Ryan and I used to share. I stood at my window, looking out at the city spread below, all lights and possibilities. My grandmother had started with nothing but shares and patience. She'd built a trap that took 20 years to spring, a plan that required her death to activate. She'd played a game so long that she never got to see the ending. But I was living that ending. Every day I was writing the conclusion to her story, and it was beautiful. It was everything she'd wanted it to be. I raised my glass to the window, to the city, to the ghost of Margaret Sinclair Chen. "We did it, Grandma," I whispered. "We made them see us." The city lights twinkled in response like 1,000 stars winking in agreement. Somewhere out there, another invisible girl was probably crying over some boy who didn't deserve her, not knowing that her life was about to change, that her inheritance, literal or figurative, was waiting just around the corner. I hoped she'd be ready when it came. I hoped she'd be brave enough to claim it. I hoped she'd use it not just for revenge, but for redemption, not just for personal gain, but for lifting others up. Most of all, I hoped she'd remember what I'd learned, that being invisible isn't a weakness if you use it right. It's a superpower, a way of seeing everything while being seen by no one. And when you finally become visible, when you finally claim your place in the light, you bring all that knowledge with you. The next morning would bring new challenges. Charles would continue to push back against changes. Other shareholders would have their own agendas. The old guard would keep trying to restore the old ways. But I was ready for them. I had my grandmother's patience, my mother's strength, and my own hard-won knowledge of how the game was played. I had 38% of a multi-billion-dollar company and the will to use it. Most importantly, I had a mission that went beyond money or power. I had the chance to change lives, to rewrite stories, to turn invisible people into forces to be reckoned with. Ryan had left me for the boss's daughter. It was the best thing that ever happened to me, because in losing him, I'd found myself. In being discarded, I'd discovered my worth. In becoming invisible, I'd learned to see everything. And now, with my grandmother's legacy as my weapon and her memory as my guide, I was making sure that no one in my orbit would ever be invisible again. The wine was excellent, the view was spectacular, and tomorrow was full of possibilities. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But now, it was work that mattered. Work that made a difference, work that honored the woman who'd seen all of this coming 20 years ago. I pulled up the foundation's scholarship applications, hundreds of them, each one representing an invisible person hoping to be seen. Each one a potential Emma Hartley or Maria Santos waiting for their chance. I began to read, looking for the spark, the hunger, the determination that marked someone ready to transform their invisibility into power. My grandmother had given me that chance. Now it was my turn to pass it on. The city hummed outside my window, alive with dreams and schemes. In the Chen Industries building, empty now except for security guards and cleaning crews, more invisible people keeping the visible world running, my nameplate sat on a door, my influence embedded in every policy and procedure. Charles Chen had built an empire on nepotism and favoritism. I was rebuilding it on merit and justice. He'd made his family name synonymous with power. I was making my grandmother's name synonymous with opportunity. The scholarship applications blurred together after a while. So many stories of struggle, so many dreams deferred. But I kept reading, knowing that somewhere in these pages was the next person whose life I could change, the next invisible soul ready to step into the light. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Williams. "Quarterly reports look amazing. The board is thrilled. Your grandmother would be proud." Yes, I thought. She would be. But more than that, she'd be satisfied. She'd played the longest game imaginable and won. Through me, she'd gotten everything. Justice for the past, power in the present, and a legacy that would outlast us all. I worked until midnight, approving scholarships, reviewing proposals, planning the next phase of reforms. When I finally closed my laptop, my eyes were burning and my shoulders ached, but I felt energized rather than exhausted. This was what purpose felt like. This was what it meant to use power for something greater than yourself. This was what my grandmother had envisioned when she'd held on to those shares through poverty and illness, through rejection and loneliness. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The designer clothes were gone, replaced with simple pajamas. The makeup was washed off, revealing the face beneath. But the jade pendant still hung around my neck, a reminder of where I'd come from and where I was going. 3 years ago, I'd been nobody. The invisible girl from accounting whose boyfriend had left her for someone more important. Now, I was the largest shareholder of a major corporation, the founder of a thriving foundation, the woman who'd brought down an empire and rebuilt it better. But most importantly, I was visible. Not because someone else had chosen to see me, but because I'd demanded to be seen. Because I'd claimed my place in the light and refused to step back into the shadows. The next morning came too soon, bringing with it a full schedule of meetings and decisions. But I woke up ready, eager even. Every day was a chance to make a difference, to honor my grandmother's memory, to prove that the invisible ones were the ones who really ran the world. I dressed carefully, professional but not ostentatious, powerful but approachable. The jade pendant nestled against my collar, mostly hidden but always there. A secret strength, like the shares my grandmother had hidden for so long. The city was already alive when I left my building, rushing with its usual urgency. But I didn't hurry. I walked deliberately, taking in the morning air, the sounds of commerce and conversation. This was my city now, in a way it had never been when I was invisible. Not because I owned it, but because I was finally part of it, a player rather than an observer. At the office, the day unfolded with its usual mix of challenges and victories. A hostile takeover attempt to deflect, a new initiative to launch, a dozen fires to put out, and twice as many opportunities to seize. Through it all, I thought of my grandmother, sitting in her modest apartment, carefully tracking her shares, planning for a future she'd never see. She'd had such faith, in justice, in patience, in the granddaughter she barely knew. I wouldn't let her down. I couldn't. As the sun set on another day, painting the city in shades of gold and amber, I stood in the boardroom where everything had changed, where I'd walked in as nobody and walked out as somebody, where invisible had become undeniable. The city spread out below me, full of invisible people living invisible lives, not knowing that someone was fighting for them, that someone saw them, that someone remembered what it was like to be them. Ryan had left me for the boss's daughter. In doing so, he'd set in motion a chain of events that had changed everything, not just for me, but for hundreds of employees, thousands of scholarship recipients, and countless others who'd benefit from the reforms we'd implemented. He'd thought he was trading up. Instead, he'd traded away the one person who could have helped him become more than a corporate climber. His loss, my gain, the world's gain. I smiled, thinking of the irony. He'd left me because I wasn't important enough. Now I was too important for him to ever reach again. He'd left me for Victoria Chen. Now Victoria worked for a company that had to compete with the one I controlled. But the real irony was that I was grateful. Grateful for the pain that had led to growth. Grateful for the betrayal that had led to triumph. Grateful for the invisibility that had taught me to see everything. My phone rang. Charles, asking about tomorrow's strategy meeting. We talked for a few minutes about business, but before he hung up, he said something unexpected. "You know, Emma, I used to think Margaret was weak for choosing love over family. Now I realize we were the weak ones, choosing money over love. She got both in the end, didn't she? Through you. We all did, I said. That's what she wanted, for everyone to win. Except Ryan Morrison, Charles said with a dry chuckle. I heard he's struggling in Chicago. He's finding his level, I said neutrally. We all do, eventually. After the call, I gathered my things and prepared to leave. Another day done, another small victory achieved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I was ready for them. As I walked through the office, I passed the accounting department. My old desk was still there, now occupied by a bright young man fresh out of college. He looked up as I passed, clearly nervous to see the major shareholder in his humble corner of the building. Work hard, I told him, but more importantly, watch everything, learn everything. You never know when being invisible might become your greatest advantage. He nodded, confused but intrigued. Maybe he'd understand someday. Maybe he'd have his own moment of transformation, or maybe he'd just do his job and go home, content to be invisible. Either way was fine. The world needed both kinds of people. The elevator carried me down to the lobby where the evening shift was just starting. Security guards, cleaning staff, maintenance workers, all invisible, all essential. I made a mental note to review their compensation packages. If we were going to truly reform this company, it had to start from the bottom up. Outside, the city was transitioning from day to night, from one shift of invisible workers to another. The cycle continued, endless and essential. But now, at least in one company, those workers were being seen, valued, compensated fairly. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. As my taxi carried me home through the darkening streets, I thought about the girl I'd been 3 years ago. Heartbroken, humiliated, invisible. If I could go back and tell her what was coming, would I? Or was the not knowing, the surprise of it all, part of what made it so powerful? I decided I wouldn't change anything. Every moment of pain had led to this. Every tear had watered the seeds of change. Every moment of invisibility had prepared me for the spotlight. Ryan had left me for the boss's daughter. It was the first line of a story that ended with me owning the boss's company. It was the setup to a punchline that took 3 years to deliver. It was the best, worst thing that had ever happened to me. In my apartment that night, I raised a final toast. To Ryan, for his betrayal, to Victoria, for her ambition, to Charles, for his eventual humility, to my mother, for her strength, and most of all, to my grandmother, for her patience and planning. Thank you, I whispered to them all, to the city, to the universe that had conspired to bring me to this moment. Thank you for making me invisible. It taught me to see everything. The city lights twinkled in response, and somewhere out there, another invisible girl was probably crying into her pillow, not knowing that her story was just beginning, that her invisibility was not a curse, but a gift, that the boy who'd just broken her heart had actually set her free. I hoped she'd figure it out faster than I had, but even if she didn't, even if it took her years to understand, she'd get there eventually. We invisible ones always do. We watch, we learn, we wait, and then, when the moment is right, we become undeniable. The jade pendant caught the light as I moved, a flash of green in the darkness. My grandmother's legacy, worn close to my heart. A reminder that some games take generations to play, but the victory, when it comes, is all the sweeter for the waiting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to lift up the invisible and humble the arrogant. But tonight, I was content to sit in my hard-won success, to appreciate how far I'd come, to honor the woman whose patience had made it all possible. Ryan had left me for the boss's daughter. Then I inherited the company and fired them both. But that was just the beginning of the story. The real story was what came after, the reforms, the foundation, the lives changed, the invisible made visible. The real story was about power used properly, about revenge transformed into justice, about love proving stronger than money, even when money was the weapon used to prove it. My grandmother had been right about everything. Love was worth choosing, even when it cost you everything. but she'd also been smart enough to keep a backup plan, to play a game so long that her opponents forgot they were playing. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the day, the weight of responsibility, the weight of legacy. It was heavy, but I was strong enough to carry it. My grandmother had made sure of that, leaving me not just shares, but a story. Not just money, but a mission. The city hummed its nighttime lullaby, sirens and car horns, music from bars, and the distant rumble of the subway. The sound of millions of invisible people, living their lives, dreaming their dreams, not knowing that someone was fighting for them from the top of a glass tower. But I knew, and I would keep fighting. For my grandmother, for Maria Santos, for every invisible person who deserved to be seen, for the girl I used to be, and the woman I'd become. Ryan had left me for the boss's daughter. It was the best thing that ever happened to me, and to everyone else who'd been invisible for too long. The story wasn't over. It would never really be over as long as there were invisible people to lift up and arrogant people to bring down. But this chapter, the chapter that started with heartbreak and ended with triumph, was complete. I'd won. More importantly, we'd won. All of us invisible ones who'd been overlooked and underestimated. My grandmother's patience had become my power, and my power had become our victory. The city slept, but I lay awake a little longer, planning tomorrow's battles, tomorrow's victories. There was so much work still to do, so many lives still to change. But for tonight, it was enough to know that I'd kept my promise. I'd made them see us. I'd made them respect us. I'd made them understand that the invisible ones were the ones who really ran the world. And I'd done it all because a boy had left me for someone he thought was more important. His loss, my gain, the world's gain. The jade pendant was warm against my skin as I finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of my grandmother, young and defiant, choosing love over money and somehow, miraculously, ending up with both. End. Thank you for listening to my story. If this story moved you, and if you believe that everyone deserves to have their true worth seen, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Comment below and tell me, what was the moment in the story that resonated with you the most? And if you want more powerful stories about finding your strength and overcoming the odds, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's next.